In 1977, something shifted in American kitchens that most families never consciously registered. The food didn't look different. The plates weren't suddenly empty, but what filled them had begun to change in ways that wouldn't be understood for decades. This wasn't announced. There were no warnings printed on boxes, no public debates in town halls, no moment when anyone said clearly what was happening. The transformation occurred through substitution. Ingredients were swapped, processes were streamlined, and because it happened gradually, across years rather than overnight, it felt like nothing had changed at all. What replaced real food didn't arrive as a threat. It arrived as convenience, as progress, as the modern way to feed a family in less time, with less effort, for less money. And for a generation that had survived rationing, that had known genuine scarcity, this felt like abundance. It felt like winning. Butter became margarine, lard became vegetable oil, sugar became high fructose corn syrup. Each substitution was presented as an improvement, cheaper, shelf-stable, scientifically optimized. The language was clinical, reassuring. The changes were sold as advancements in food science, backed by institutions people had been taught to trust. Most people didn't question it. There was no reason to. The new products sat on the same shelves, in similar packaging, often with the same brand names. They were prepared the same way, eaten at the same tables during the same rituals. Breakfast still looked like breakfast, dinner still looked like dinner. But the composition had shifted beneath the surface. This blended into everyday life because it was designed to. The food industry had learned that people resist sudden change but adapt to gradual shifts without noticing, one ingredient at a time, one product reformulation at a time, one generation at a time. By the time a child born in the 80s became an adult, the food system they inherited bore little resemblance to the one their grandparents had known. But there was no single moment to point to, no clear before and after. Most people never noticed this at the time. It seemed too small to matter back then. What made this transformation possible wasn't just technology or economics, it was trust. Families trusted that what appeared in grocery stores was fundamentally safe, fundamentally real. They trusted regulatory agencies to maintain standards. They trusted food companies not to compromise nutrition for profit. And for decades, that trust went unexamined because there was no visible reason to question it. The system operated on the assumption that if something was legal to sell, it must be acceptable to eat. If it passed regulatory approval, it must be safe. If it was marketed to children, it must be appropriate for children. These assumptions were never stated outright, but they governed behavior. They governed purchasing decisions. They governed what parents felt comfortable feeding their families. And during this period, something else was happening. Cooking was being redefined. Home kitchens were being repositioned not as the center of food preparation, but as staging areas for reheating, assembling, and serving products made elsewhere. Scratch cooking began to feel outdated, time-consuming, inefficient. The microwave became as essential as the stove. The freezer expanded, pantries filled with boxes instead of ingredients. This wasn't accidental. Entire marketing campaigns were built around the message that modern families didn't have time to cook the old way, that working mothers needed shortcuts, that children preferred foods designed specifically for them in bright packages with cartoon mascots. The implication was always the same. Real cooking belonged to the past. The future was packaged, processed, and optimized. Recipe cards from the 1950s and 60s reflected this shift. Instructions began to include brand names. Canned soups became base ingredients. Boxed mixes replaced flour and eggs. What had once been treated as whole foods were now treated as raw materials to be recombined with processed products. The line between cooking and assembly blurred, then disappeared. The real impact appeared years later, not immediately, not in ways that could be traced back to a single product or a single decision, but in patterns, in rising rates of conditions that had once been rare, in children developing health problems that previous generations hadn't faced until middle age, if at all, in bodies that seemed to process food differently than they had before. By the time these consequences became visible, habits were already set. Taste preferences had been established in childhood. Convenience had become non-negotiable. Whole generations had grown up without learning to cook from raw ingredients, without understanding what food had been before the substitutions began. The knowledge had been lost gradually enough that most people didn't realize it was gone. And because the changes had been so slow, so incremental, it became difficult to pinpoint when things had gone wrong. There was no single villain to blame, no one company, no one ingredient, no one policy decision that could be isolated as the cause. The system had shifted as a whole, across industries, across regulatory bodies, across cultural norms. And once shifted, it became self-reinforcing. Food scientists optimized for shelf life, not nutrition. Economists optimized for profit margins, not public health. Regulators responded to industry lobbying, not independent research. And consumers, operating within a system they hadn't designed and didn't fully understand, made the best choices they could with the information they had, which was often incomplete, often misleading, often shaped by the same companies selling the products.
This wasn't a conspiracy. It was a structure, a system built on incentives that didn't align with the long-term well-being of the people it was meant to serve. No one had to intend harm for harm to occur. They only had to prioritize growth, efficiency, scale, and the rest followed. The substitutions continued. Real cheese became cheese product. Fruit became fruit flavored. Chicken became chicken formed from separated meat. Each time, the replacement was cheaper to produce, easier to transport, more shelf-stable, more profitable. And each time, it was presented as functionally equivalent to what it replaced, sometimes even superior. Labels became longer, ingredient lists filled with words that weren't foods, preservatives, emulsifiers, artificial flavors, natural flavors that weren't natural in any traditional sense, dyes derived from petroleum, sweeteners engineered in laboratories. None of this was hidden exactly. It was all printed on the package, but it was printed in small type, in technical language, in ways that required effort to decode. Most families didn't read the labels carefully. There was no reason to. They trusted that someone else was doing that work, that regulators were ensuring safety, that if something was dangerous, it wouldn't be sold, that if something was unhealthy, it wouldn't be marketed to children. These seemed like reasonable assumptions, but they were never actually true. The regulatory framework had been designed in an earlier era for a different kind of food system. It assumed that most of what people ate would be whole foods, prepared at home, with occasional processed items as supplements. It didn't anticipate a system where processed foods became the foundation of most diets, where children consumed more artificial colors and flavors than any previous generation in human history, where a substantial portion of daily calories came from substances that hadn't existed 50 years earlier. And so the framework didn't protect against what actually happened. It protected against acute toxicity, against immediate harm, against single ingredients consumed in isolation. But it didn't account for combinations, for cumulative exposure, for the long-term effects of eating substances that were technically safe in small doses, but were now present in dozens of products consumed daily. This gap between what was regulated and what needed to be regulated widened over time. As food science became more sophisticated, as chemical engineering allowed for more complex formulations, As global supply chains enabled cheaper sourcing of industrial ingredients, the food system moved faster than the regulatory system could adapt. And the result was a marketplace full of products that met legal standards but didn't necessarily meet any meaningful definition of food. Some people did notice: nutritionists, independent researchers, doctors seeing patterns in their patients. But their warnings were drowned out by larger forces: industry-funded studies, marketing budgets that dwarfed public health campaigns, cultural momentum that had already decided convenience was non-negotiable. By the time the data became undeniable, the system was too entrenched to change quickly. Perhaps some of this feels familiar. Perhaps you remember when certain foods tasted different, when ingredients were simpler, when cooking meant something other than following package instructions. Or perhaps you don't. Perhaps this is simply how food has always been, for as long as you can remember. The absence of memory doesn't mean nothing changed. It just means the change happened slowly enough that it became normal. And once something becomes normal, it becomes invisible. It stops being questioned. It stops being examined. It simply is. Similar decisions followed in agriculture, in food processing, in the way crops were grown, animals were raised, products were formulated. Each decision made sense in isolation. Each one optimized for something, just not for health, not for nutrition, not for the people who would spend decades eating the results. And this pattern didn't stop there.